Alright, today we're going to talk about another real estate investment valuation metric called the 1% rule. The 1% rule states that you should rent the property for a monthly rent of 1% or more compared to the purchase price. So for example, if we have an $80,000 house, the monthly rent should be at minimum $800 a month. And going off the 1% rule, multiplying it by 12 months, we can see that our annual gross rent will be 12% of the purchase price. This is the bare minimum in order to ensure that you have safe cash flow and your property is not negatively cash flowing. Let's do some math. So another example, if you had a $70,000 house, you might be able to rent it out for $700 a month, which is the minimum 1% rule. Now, a $70,000 house is getting cheaper, closer to the lower income housing, and oftentimes it'll rent for a little higher than $700. So for example, let's say you could for some reason get $1,050, you'd be at a 1.5% rate, and if you could rent it for $1,400, you'd be renting it out at 2% a month of the purchase price. Typically, it's going to be hard to rent a $70,000 house though for $1,400, but this is just showing you an example of what the rent would be of the purchase price and how it would be at a 2% rule. A case where this might work would be if you were buying a $140,000 house that would rent 1% at $1,400, but for some reason that house was really beat up and you were able to acquire it for $70,000 because it was going to need a lot of rehabbing and you're going to end up forcing some equity into the property. So let's look at two different deals. Let's look at number one, a low income housing example, where you could buy a house for $50,000 in a part of town that's not so nice, that not a lot of people want to live in. So it's going to be mostly rental properties, and you can get about $800 a month. So $800 a month, and you bought it for $50,000, so your ratio is going to be a 1.6%. So you're pretty safe above that 1% minimum threshold. So for purchase price $50,000, you put $5,000 down, take a loan for $45,000 from the bank, and it's a 30-year loan at 5% interest. So you can expect your loan payment to be $2,900, which we're going to subtract off our annual rent of $9,600, leaving us with $6,700 left to cover all of our other expenses. So if we have property taxes of $600, insurance of $1,000, maintenance will typically be 1 month's rent, and management will be 1 month's rent. Subtracting out these expenses, we are left with a net income of $3,500, which is pretty standard for lower income housing. You can expect to cash flow anywhere from $200 to $300 a month, which multiplying that by 12 months, you can expect a net income of $2,400 to $3,600 roughly. Just off a rule of thumb, for lower income housing, they typically cash flow pretty well. So your return on investment would be $3,500, and you're going to have a $5,000 investment, so that's going to give you quite a high return on investment. Now in our second example, let's say you bought a nicer house in a nicer part of town for $100,000. It's going to be tougher to rent this at a high monthly rent percent of 1.5% to 2%. Typically, the more expensive house you get into, the lower your monthly rent percent is going to start dropping close to 1%, and sometimes it'll even go below 1%. Like if you had a $400,000 house, there's no way you're going to be able to get $4,000 a month in rent. You might only be able to get $2,500 a month in rent. So that's going to be well below 1% of the purchase price of $400,000. So in this example, you see here a $100,000 house, maybe you can only get $1,100 a month from it, putting you above 1% at 1.1. So you're still safe. Now your $100,000 purchase price, you're going to put $10,000 down, take a $90,000 loan. So this time your annual rent's going to be higher at $13,200, but your loan payment is also going to be higher at $5,800, leaving you with $7,400 left to cover your expenses. Now on a more expensive property, your property taxes are going to be higher, so you're going to have $1,000. Your insurance might also go up slightly to $1,200, and your maintenance and management should go up a little as well because you're charging a higher monthly rent, so your property manager is going to want 1 month's rent. Now your net income after subtracting out these expenses will only be $3,000, and on a $10,000 investment, you have a 30% return on investment. So typically right off the bat, you're going to think, well, the lower income housing produced a greater cash flow, and it also had a higher return on investment, which is true. Typically lower income housings do cash flow better, but you got to remember that part of your loan pay down was principal, so you're going to pay more out in principal on a $100,000 house than you are on a $50,000 house. So you forgot to factor in some of that, but at the same time, a $100,000 house is probably going to have better appreciation than a $50,000 house in a bad part of town. So you might not cash flow as well in the $100,000 house, but it'll make it up through appreciation. Overall, if you're looking to cash flow though, you might want to stick to the lower income family housing, but you're also going to have some beat up houses typically after your tenants leave, which is going to need a more expensive maintenance repair budget factored in to cover all the expenses once your tenants move out. But overall, that wraps up the 1% rule today. Make sure that your monthly rent is at least 1% of the purchase price in order to make sure that you're going to generate enough cash flow to cover all your expenses plus your loan.